Signing the letter, "Your Ursula," she slid the thin, almost translucent paper into the envelope. Sitting back in her chair, she stared at the table before her, that upon which the letter now rested. Light sunk into the room from the large window, but the bars beyond drew long shadows across the floor. This little room had been her home for quite some months now. She knew how long when measured in days, but time goes so differently when the only points of reference are the turning of the months on a calendar and the changing warmth of the sun. Even the possibility of witnessing the seasons come and go were diminished when no view to a world outside of a courtyard, where a solitary tree grew as best it could and surrounded by walls of brick that raised high as a Teutonic castle, limited the winds and warming or cooling movement of air. Not even the birds made the branches their home. Yet it did not stop the gaze from staring beyond the glass and escaping from the walls that contained her. She could remember the days when she had walked in the Grunewald with friends, with Annie Hoffmann and Trude Rosenmeer, when there were only trees to catch their idle chatter, and they could vent frustrations without repercussions. But her musings were often cut short by catching her reflection in the glass. 27 years old, but her mind and body were feeling older. Strange how a life that is technically of rest can be so tiresome. She saw her wavy black hair that once had hung loose to below the ear was now long and tied back. Bright, curious eyes were sunken and withdrawn, and her mouth had seemed to have forgotten how to smile. Best not to look too long, she thought, and brought her mind's wanderings back into the room to which she was confined. The room was perpetually cold. So thick were the walls that the cold of winter remained through the heights of summer, buried deep within the layers of baked bricks. Blankets that were for sleeping were often wrapped around as one paced the room end to end slightly more than twice the length of the average human, and little more than once wide. There, it had to be said, had been a Prussian sensibility, however, when it came to the prison's designs. Beds were on springs so that, during the day, they could be stored against the wall, thus opening the room up. Each room had a writing desk, small but suitable, not screwed to the ground so the prisoners could move them as they wished, a large table that they were to take their meals on, and a small cupboard hung on the wall for personal effects or storage for plates and cups. It in fact bore more resemblance to a dorm room than a cell. That was of course until the heavy door opened onto the corridor. Walkways were narrow, light flooded down from a large glass ceiling and down through the open space to the ground floor, illuminating for any who peered over on their first visit the 3 floors of cells. The number of inmates could be told from the sheer amount of cell doors that looked onto the corridor, but for the amount of people, it was surprisingly quiet. Naturally, voices echoed around the corridor, reverberating off of brick and steel, but they couldn't be heard in the cells. But there was little to be heard anyway. The society within the block she had been placed was one she certainly considered lowly. Prostitutes and drug addicts, amongst others, that she found the conversational skills of lacking. Ursula tried to escape the mundanity of the conversations by choosing to read. The library at the prison on Barnumstrasse was well stocked. It had a number of large bookcases that stretched from floor almost to the ceiling, and to a height where one would have to step onto a chair to reach. But she worried, and she worried much. Her mind kept racing back to those moments when sleep had been deprived from her, when she felt that her bones could not take another beating or her stomach another punch, when the pain had grown too much, and she had said things she wished she hadn't. Had she implicated others in the crime for which she was accused? Could she have held her tongue a little more, taken the blame upon herself, and saved the others? She asked, but there were no answers. Guilt gnawed at her, tore at her. Did she say something that had affected Fritz or even Werner? Had she betrayed confidence that had been placed upon her? Had she led others to a fate that awaited her? The cell door opened. "Out, quick," the voice commanded. Ursula stood. She had been preparing for this day for months, since her fate had been decided for her in January. Now the calendar read August, and those long, slow days that had passed within the confines of these walls seemed to have passed all too quick. She looked at the book that rested on her reading desk. where she'd written her letter. It was by Wilhelm Pinder, entitled Vom Wesen und Werden deutscher Formen, die Kunst der deutschen Kaiserzeit. Her bookmark rose from its pages. She remembered the last book she had read, Wilhelm Mieslen, on the Renaissance and Baroque periods in Germany, and lamented that she would not finish Wilhelm Pinder's. It would remain to her forever unfinished. The letter, the guard nodded towards the table. Bring it with you. It will be sent later. She took the steps back. She had only managed to take 2 or 3 forward initially, but they were the first upon a journey she had been preparing for. To return, even a short way, unsettled her, and she found the strength which she had been building up flow from her. It grew worse as she picked up the letter from the table with a shaking hand. Holding it close to her chest, she hoped to find warmth within the words she had written to her parents. Along the corridor she walked. Her footsteps had not echoed so loudly since the day she had arrived. The guard walked behind her. To the steps they moved, and then down to the ground floor, the light above gradually getting further away, and the recesses grew darker. Then light burst in. A guard had opened the door, and fresh air rushed by. She felt her hair raise with the currents of summer air. Her eyes narrowed as they strained against the unfiltered light of day. Her heart jumped just a little with the hope that warmth brings. Then the guard moved her forwards, and the walls towering over her once more. A bus waited in the courtyard. It was long and a deep shade of blue. The rear doors were open. 2 men in uniforms stood smoking by the driver's door. Towards the rear of the bus, she was guided and helped up the large step from ground into the darkness of the interior. A few faces hung ghostly white within the dark, staring at the metal floor. Some had streaks in their cheeks where tears had cleared dust and grime. Others stared emptily, their resolve having been sapped by the emotions of their knowing of their fate. At least one face she recognized, but it would be cruel to find comfort at this moment in a face known. Soon the doors were shut. The raw sound of metal hitting against metal made a few jump. Others stayed within their trance. Then the bus began to rock slightly from side to side as the engine was brought into life and the transport bus was drawn forward. Little light was allowed entry into their space, only glints from where metal had been eaten away by rust or around the areas where blacked-out windows might be opened. Even for those who had grown in Berlin and knew its streets well, the disorientation soon crept in. They could not see their city still standing beautifully in the summer light. They could not see the taint that the Hakenkreuz had brought over it, like a great shadow soaked in blood, the thing that they had been fighting against. They could see no landmarks, no pavilions and no church steeples, only the dark before their eyes. It might have been a matter of a few minutes, it might have been hours. Time ran at different speeds for all those within. To those outside it was just an ever-long bus, nothing special, they knew not what was within. But eyes would have seen it run north from the centre of Berlin, along Rosenthaler Strasse, left at the Elisabethkirche, and along Invalidenstrasse, passing before the multiple archways of the Stettiner Bahnhof and behind the Stadtbahn at Lehrte. The bus inconspicuously drove forward. A right and a left brought it to Turmstrasse, past the city hospital, and a right then followed onto Beusselstrasse. Ears inside, if looking to hear, could hear the sounds of the trains rattling along in the Gutsbahnhof. The national lines and those lines that transported the people of the city about on the Ringbahn, or locally named Dog's Head. The whistle of a train, though, to all who knew their destination, reverberated within the knowledge they were approaching their destination. For if those eyes that had viewed the bus but not seen it were here now, they would see the bus trundling onwards into the shadow of a brick building, which only the birds on high would have seen to take on the shape of a cross. But for those on earth knew it was anything but holy. For this was Plötzensee.
Achtung, Achtung. Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin im Voxhaus. Meine Damen und Herren.
Welcome to the Achtung History Podcast, produced by theberlintourguide.com and presented by myself, Simon J. James. This week, Resistance, Ursula Goetze. Ursula Goetze was born to Margarete and Otto Goetze on the 29th of March, 1916. She was born at a time when the world was in the depths of a war that was bringing havoc to a continent. Berlin, the city in which she was born, although at the center of the war, politically and geographically, was far from the fronts, and despite the number of recruitment posters, troop transports, and empty beds within the city, the war was far away. Otto had avoided, or was not called to, the front. As a business owner, it was possible he was required not only by his business to stay in Berlin, but also by the government so that items could be produced with normality, and therefore the morale within the city would not drop with the weight of the war. His business was not one that would in any stretch be considered essential to a war effort, for he ran a wallpaper molding factory. The family, Otto, Margarete, Ursula, her older brother Eberhard, and half-sister Ilse, lived in the middle-class district of Kreuzberg. Their home was in one of the many grandiose apartment blocks constructed towards the end of the last century, the 19th, in the Kreuzberg area. Hornstrasse, number 18, later to be reorganized as number 3, was ideal. The street before was wide, and the trees that had been planted not many years before Ursula's birth were beginning to come into bloom by the time she was a young girl. With the windows open in the summer, the rattling of the tram along Yorkstrasse could be heard, as well as the clinking of glasses that rose from the beer garden of the Yorkschlosschen Kneipe that occupied the opposite corner. The Victoria Park and its waterfall that fell from the Kreuzberg Memorial was only a short stroll away, and summer days could be wistfully spent relaxing as a family on the green slopes. Otto found it easy for his work. It was, after all, a very central location, with excellent transport, and only a short walk to his father's hotel on Hedemannstrasse, the Thuringia Hof. The only downside was a large goods yard to the west, where many cattle carts were pushed along sidings in preparedness for supplying a city, and a great city at that. At the age of 6, Ursula was sent to the Realschule in Wilmersdorf, which required taking the conveniently located tram line at the end of her road. By 10, she was in the Oberrealschule at the bottom of the neighboring district of Neukölln. Thankfully, this also coincided with, in 1926, the opening of the purple north-south line to Bergstrasse, today's U7 and Karl-Marx-Strasse underground station, which meant just a short walk from the station to the Albert Dürer Oberrealschule. Walking through Neukölln, Ursula could not have ignored the revolutionary atmosphere that persisted amongst the workers. Bergstrasse itself, along with the side streets of Zeiten, Prinz Hangeri, Kopf and Thomasstrasse, were a hotbed of activity for the left wing in Berlin that in 1928 would distance itself from the Social Democrats, who were decried as the left arm of fascism, and became more radical and revolutionary under its leader Ernst Thälmann. From a young age, Ursula displayed a keen interest in politics that was considered highly unusual. She found herself leaning towards the plight of the workers and drawn into the discussions that centered around the workers and communism within the city. But it wasn't just on the streets that Ursula found the words of the workers resonating. Her brother Eberhard had also grown political, and he and his sister would often be found in political discussion. The rise of the National Socialists in the south of Germany and its spread towards liberal Berlin worried the siblings, and they found a unity in the anti-fascist struggle. Eberhard soon introduced Ursula to other members of the Communist Party, both old and young, and it was during this time in the early 1930s, as Germany fell into deep recession, that she joined the Kommunistische Jungenverband Deutschlands, the KJVD, the youth wing of the Communist Party. Whilst often the children who joined the KJVD were from parents who were strong supporters of the party themselves, this was not so with the Goetzes. She was much more independent than many of the other children that were members and inclined to pursue her own path. The KJVD was peaking in support at this time. Over 35,000 children across Germany were members, as the political spectrum of Germany was becoming more polarizing between right and left. Since 1924, the support for the KPD had been rising, from 9% of the votes in the Reichstag election of that year to 10.6% at the next vote in 1928. The horrendous treatment of the workers in the Blood May riots of 1929 only weakened the party to which the KPD had once been associated, and that was attempting to control Germany, the Social Demokratisches Partei Deutschlands, or the SPD. Support was trickling away from the SPD and centralist parties, some of which found its way to the KPD, but most, thanks to the financial crisis and the Treaty of Versailles, was finding its way to the NSDAP of Adolf Hitler. Many in Berlin saw the threat that the NSDAP and Hitler represented to liberal German society, tolerance and peace. The Social Democrats organized the Eisernen Front to be an organization that stood against monarchy, the NSDAP, and importantly, the KPD. Ernst Thälmann of the KPD described the Eisernen Front as the terrorist organization of the left arm of social fascism. The KPD received in July 1932 14.6% of the vote, the SPD 21.6%, and the NSDAP 37.3%. Together, the KPD and SPD might have stemmed the bloodthirsty tide of Hitler when its popularity was at its zenith. In the next elections, a few months later, in November, the KPD rose in support to 16.9%. The SPD still fell, but to 20.4%, as did the NSDAP to 33.1%. But still they could not unite to fight the common enemy that was Hitler and his NSDAP. During this time, Ursula participated often in rallies against Hitler. She distributed leaflets, placarded, placed posters, and urged those she met to focus their support on the real workers' party, the KPD. It was probable that she would have been to the Karl Liebknecht House on Bürlowplatz, the headquarters of the KPD, seen the building dressed in the hanging red flags with hammer and sickles of the Soviet Union, seen the large white lettering that read Heraus zur antifaschistischen Aktion gegen Krieg, Hunger and Faschismus, KPD, Liste 3. She had grown concerned in the period of strife for the welfare of the people as one mass, that many from all areas of society had struggled to survive in the world economic crisis that had hit Germany particularly hard. However, the divide that stood between the popular opposition of Hitler and the NSDAP allowed for a chasm through which Hitler marched and later seized power. From the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor, through the burning of the Reichstag, arrest of Thälmann, to the declaration of emergency powers placed within the hands of Hitler, the suppression of the opposition began and rose until there was little. The leaders of the KPD predominantly fled. Those that did not were interred in camps. With the leaders purged, those that remained committed communist and principally anti-fascists became an underground organization. In those early days of the Nazi reign of terror in Berlin, it was still common for leafleting, discussions, poster hanging to take place, and Ursula continued in this vein. Leaving her house on Hornstrasse and using the cover of night, Ursula would slip into the darkness and distribute anti-fascist material. However, the Nazis' grip on power and the German people was tightening all the while. The Gestapo, the secret police of Nazi Germany, was founded in April 1933 and expanded quickly under its leader Rudolf Diels. The police state was growing. With more power passing into the hands of the police, every person that Ursula passed in that night held the potential to be an informant. Fear began to find its way and festered within society. If an anti-NSDAP piece of propaganda was found in a home, suspicion would be placed of all those in the building who did not report it. If it was not reported at all, there was a real risk of all those under the roof becoming guests of the Gestapo. On the street, every long coat and fedora could be hiding a Gestapo agent. Even if every care was taken, there still remained the potential that a gaze had followed those dissenting. Often the sound of footsteps would be enough cause for the would-be posterer to flee into the night and dump their supply of material as early as possible. For Ursula, on one occasion, she was not quick enough in fleeing and found herself arrested and taken to a prison cell and presented with her first taste of the brutality of the regime. Her brief but tortuous stay at the hands of the Gestapo was enough to tell Ursula that the methods that were common during the 3 days of Prussia before the conservatives of Franz von Papen had stolen its democracy were over. In this knowledge, for her own safety and that of her family, she vowed to take a more subversive route in her resistance. By day, she continued her studies, now at the Städtisches Handelsschule in Neukölln. She worked hard, but her mind was often distracted by the plight of the people who were falling foul of the ideals and whims of the NSDAP regime. She began raising money for those affected, for fellow anti-fascists, for communists, and for Jews who were feeling the wrath of the Gauleiter of Berlin, Joseph Goebbels' anti-Semitic rhetoric. By 1935, she had decided that enough was enough and dropped out of her training to be a clerk. She found work as a stenographer and typist and began a search for other ways to educate the people to the horrors of the Nazi regime and bring them to her cause. On holidays with her family, which they took by train to Czechoslovakia, France, Austria, and Italy, when they could feel freer for the eventual long reach of Hitler and the Gestapo was yet to leave the borders of a 1918 Germany, she met with local communists, with people who had fled the regime before they'd found themselves behind barbed wire and steel gates. Those people gave her pamphlets, papers, transcripts of speeches that could be used in Berlin to open the eyes of the people. Since May 1933 and the burning of books, the regime had been eliminating the texts and works of all those that were considered against the regime, be them books or papers by Jews, communists, socialists, or centralists, that fell not within the ideology of the NSDAP or might be used against them. Ursula smuggled these texts back and handed them to the groups that she met secretly with. In 1937, her two worlds came to a crossroads. She had ventured to Paris, where many of the KPD had fled. Paris itself had a rich history of revolution, of uprisings by the people, and its bohemian cafes and open atmosphere was allowing for freedoms to be enjoyed that had long since been extinguished in Germany. But 1937 was a special year. It was the year of the International Exposition of Art and Technology in Modern Life. The exhibition was awash with the pavilions of nations. The Italians, Swiss, Belgians, Swedish, and Czechoslovaks occupied grand modern buildings that flourished the banks of the Seine with glass and steel. Other pavilions spoke of the technology of hygiene, agriculture, and futurism. Ursula wandered the exhibition grounds set beneath the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. Yet no one could dismiss the two towering monoliths that bore the weight of the personification of ideologies. Rising tall, taller than any other point in the grounds, bar the Eiffel Tower, the eagle of fascism stared at the crossed hammer and sickle raised aloft by the bronzed man and woman of communism. The extreme struggle Europe was about to be placed in, personified in Paris. Ursula returned to Berlin and was devout on continuing her education, an education she hoped would lead to educating others. She enrolled in the Heilische Abendgymnasium in Berlin-Schöneberg. The aim was to study for her Abitur, her leaving exams, that would allow for entry, if passed, to university. She quickly came to know the people in the class and found that some of them had also been members of the KGVD and others shared her ideals. They were appalled at the NSDAP's treatment of the Jews, shocked by the rhetoric, the police, and the fragmentation of society. Quickly a group formed consisting of Friedrich Rehmer, Otto Gollnau, Fritz Thiel, Werner Krauss, and Eva Rittmeister. Eva's husband John worked as a doctor at the mental health clinic in Nikolassee in the southwest of Berlin. He'd been interested in the Soviet Union since he met a Russian emigre and been inspired to travel to the Soviet Union itself in 1932. His learnings became teachings and the group began to gather around him. With Ursula's connections in Neukölln to the secretive groups of communists that remained small and hidden, separated from one another for safety, they were able to make contact with a few and share information. Forbidden literature was discussed, and ideals for a better Germany touted about. In early 1939, Ursula made another great trip. This time it was to London, where she visited a friend that had escaped from Germany previously. However, whilst in London, Ursula had another objective. Wishing to find out what the British left was planning, or if it was willing to supply any support for her little group, she made contacts with the British Labour Party. What came of her meeting, however, is not known. Her friend and others she met urged her not to go back to Germany. They all could sense that something was arising. The Anschluss of Austria, the march into the Sudetenland and subsequent invasion of the Czech part of Czechoslovakia all were enough to cause concern that there was little to stop Hitler's march for more land. Ursula, however, was committed to the cause on which she had embarked. She knew that the fight against the Nazis would be more difficult from abroad, and although it would be more dangerous in Berlin, she was determined to return. Yet only a year into her studies, Germany invaded Poland and began the Second World War. If the group was perturbed by knowledge garnered of the equal Soviet invasion from the east of Poland, it is not known. New challenges arose as members of the circle were called up to the army, or curfews were put in place, meaning moving around was even more difficult than it had been before. But Poland fell relatively quickly, and the allies of France and Britain that had promised to protect the young republic did nothing to protect it. It was around this time that Ursula's grandfather passed away. Her grandfather had owned and operated a hotel on Handemannstrasse by the name of Thüringer Hof Hotel. Her father and mother decided to continue with the business, and although it was not far between the family apartment and the hotel, they opted to relocate solely to the hotel, leaving the flat predominantly to the free use of Ursula. Quickly, but quietly, it became a place to gather with friends who shared her ideals and discuss how they could resist. In the family room of the apartment, they would gather around the Volksempfänger, the radio receiver produced by Otto Giesing upon the request of Joseph Goebbels, so that all within the Reich would have access to the Führer's voice. They ignored the little tag that hung from the radio that read, "Denke daran, das Abhören ausländischer Send ist ein Verbrechen gegen die Nationalsicherheit unseres Volkes. Es wird auf Befehl des Führers mit schweren Zuchthausstrafen geahndet." Remember, the interception of foreign broadcasts is a crime against the national security of our people. It is punishable by severe prison sentences by order of the Führer. The dials did not have the markings of the frequencies of the BBC, but with enough fiddling it eventually could be found.
Guten Abend, hier ist der Londoner Rundfunk. Big Ben hat 8 Uhr geschlagen.
Hier ist England, hier ist England, hier ist England.
The voice came in from London. The group's ears strained to hear. It was too risky to higher the volume. Some probably wondered if the BBC knew the risks they took in listening in, and the danger the sudden blast of Beethoven's Fifth could present if a neighbour overheard. They sat and waited for the show, hoping that there would not be a knock at the door from the local Blockleiter that would signal their discovery and probable immediate arrest.
Mord und Terror sind die Methoden der herrschenden Klasse in Deutschland. Gestapo und SS sind ihre Werkzeuge. Mit Mord und Terror werden Feinde und Nebenbuhler beseitigt. Mit Mord und Terror klettern die Führer des deutschen Volkes über Berge von Leichen zur Macht.
Hier nur ein Musterbeispiel aus Tausenden für die Mordtechnik der Gestapo. Der Fall des Ingenieurs Formis.
Hallo, hier ist der Freiheitssender. Wir bringen Ihnen jetzt Nachrichten über die Vorgänge bei der Ermordung von Ernst Röhm, Gregor Strasser und über 1000 Mitgliedern der NSDAP am 3.
The programs range from news to warnings and included programs even hosted by Germans in exile, such as Thomas Mann. Ursula, despite the war, finished her Abitur and gained entry to the Friedrich Wilhelm Universität, today known as the Humboldt Universität in Berlin. The beginning of her studies, however, could not escape the war. On the day she enrolled to study philology, the study of oral languages through historical texts for both English and French, but it also happened to be the day that Nazi Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, with Vidkun Quisling seizing power in Norway that day also. At a university, her flair for languages brought a closer association with Dr. Werner Krauss, who was known to her due to Dr. Rittmeister, of whom Dr. Krauss was a friend. Dr. Krauss had been drafted from Marburg to Berlin to work as a translator in 1941 as the war had progressed. France had fallen, and an increase in French prisoners of war being used as labour in Berlin required more translators. Their flair together caught the attention of a particular circle of communist-led resistance, headed by Harro Schulz-Boysen, a Luftwaffe officer, and Arvid Harnack, a jurist. They formed a loose group of people that together later would become known as the Rote Kapelle, which is often translated as Red Orchestra. Ursula and Dr. Kraus translated the banned radio broadcasts from German into French and attempted to establish resistance groups within the prisoner of war camps, which were dotted throughout the city. In 1942, however, they made a fateful mistake. Ursula, for the first time, broke from her quiet subversion that she had begun after her initial arrest by the Gestapo in 1933. She and Dr. Kraus, against the will of her friend Fritz Thiele and group leader Harro Schulz-Boysen, designed a sticker campaign to protest Joseph Goebbels' pavilion on the Lustgarten entitled The Soviet Paradise. It was an exhibition space that occupied Berlin's Lustgartens on Museum Island. Over 9,000 square meters of land had tents and buildings constructed on top. Inside, looted items from the invasion of the Soviet Union was displayed in order to show the German people the poverty, misery, depravity, and need that existed within the Soviet Union. It was clearly lies. It showed people living underground, pictures of starving people who were in fact prisoners in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp to Berlin's north. Ursula and Dr. Kraus could not face it. Using a child's stamp kit, they printed over 1,000 stickers that they could quickly and easily place on walls in protest to the exhibition and highlight the real depravity, which was the NSDAP state. Reading, Stetige Ausstellung das Nazi-Paradies, Krieg, Hunger, Lüge, Gestapo, wie lange noch? Permanent exhibition, the Nazi Paradise, War, Hunger, Lies, Gestapo, how long? On the evening of the 17th of May, 1942, the two embarked with others to the Rote Insel. The Rote Insel, the Red Island, is a triangular area surrounded not by water but train lines. The red coming from its high-level support for the communists and socialists, with even reports of the Sturmabteilung only venturing within the district, only if heavily armed. On this evening, the group dispersed. On lampposts at Liftfahrsäule, they placed the stickers. At the gates to factories, they stuck them high so the eye could not avoid it. On the stairways to Papastrasse, today's Südkreuz, they filled the station with their protests that put their life in danger. It is not known how much effect their efforts had on the Berlin populace. Many who might have read them probably wished they hadn't, as it brought them into danger too. Others may have reported them. Then came the summer. In the summer, the students all had to commit to work duty. Ursula took a position in Kastrin that lay on the banks of the Oder, where her sister Ilse worked as a deaconess at a children's home. However, disaster was to strike. Through the failings of the Soviet Union, the Rote Kapelle was betrayed. The Gestapo had discovered the radio signals and began rounding up the members that included Schulz-Boysen and Arvid Harnack. Others were also quickly rounded up. Soon the Gestapo was on the trail of Ursula. They found her in Kastrin, and she was quickly brought back to Berlin and placed in the cells with other resistance fighters. Eventually the number swelled too greatly and the women were separated from the men and taken to the prison cells beneath the police presidium at Alexanderplatz. The torture seemed endless. The Gestapo would beat her, whip her with whips of hippopotamus hide. There seemed no end to this addition that was contained in the form of man. From her mouth they tried to extract testimony. They wished for her to name and blame those that had acted with her, but she had bit her tongue. They asked her about Werner Krauss. She said he was her boyfriend, and she worried if that was too much. They asked her about Fritz Thiel. She said nothing. Her resolve brought more beatings, more suffering, more pain, but she stood fast. She took blame for the work others had done. She hoped that she could protect more. Meanwhile, Hitler and Goering had decided to place those captured before the Reichskriegsgericht in Charlottenburg. Whilst in prison in Charlottenburg awaiting trial, other women noted how much Ursula cared for them and how polite she was, trying often to help others over herself. The decision by Hitler and Goering to place them before the highest military court in the land was to place them before the court that dished out the harshest of punishments. On the 18th of January 1943, she, Ursula, had to feel their force when they sentenced her to death. She did not know that while she had remained strong, Others had been weakened and exploited by the Gestapo. Thiel had been tortured mentally and physically, exposed to radiation and given statements that strongly implicated the group, especially Ursula. Werner Krauss had done the same. On the same day as Ursula, they both were also sentenced to death for aiding and abetting high treason. Ursula was taken across the city to Friedrichshain, where she was placed within the walls of the castle-like prison, where she paused to look over the railing, where the light cast down. The door to the bus opened, and the early evening summer sun penetrated the dark, causing many to raise their hands to shield their eyes. They needed not to be asked. The guards at the door just beckoned, and those inside shuffled along the benches that ran against the sheet metal walls until they reached the edge, and they were able to drop to the ground. Guards with guns shouldered scanned their faces as they exited, and then as a group were marched forward. Most knew the name Plötzensee. It had rung around Berlin in whispers. They, as resistance fighters, were aware that Plötzensee was a very real destination for them if they were ever to be caught, and now it loomed over them. The great brick prison building, however, was not their destination. That was for the incarcerated. Rather for them it was a much smaller and lower to the ground building that resembled a stables. They were marched forwards. Somberly, they accepted their last steps. Some turned their heads towards the sky, blue and clear. Others stared forwards towards the doorway from which no light came. Despite the stifling summer heat outside, the low-arched windows of the rooms allowed for little heat. It was cold, colder than their prison cells. The chill within the air shivered within their bones. Eyes were wide, a mixture of fear and apprehension, the darkness and the final thoughts of missed opportunities or mistakes. With a clang of metal, a door opened and more bowed heads entered the room, this time men. There was only 3. 2 Ursula did not recognize. 1 it was possible she knew. Adam, she thought it was. But what was the point in remembering faces now? The next person to enter was dressed in black. It was a young man with an oblong face and concerned eyes, introducing himself as Harold Pulschau. He informed the room he was the Protestant minister for the prison, and he asked the room if anyone wished any words of comfort. A few accepted. The minister stood in the room with those who now knew they stood in the waiting room of death. The metal door once again swung open. An officer walked through. Standing to attention in the doorway, he looked to his watch. The minute hand was fast approaching the hour. "Veselek Stanislaus," he cried. A man stepped forward. A woman cried. The officer guided him through the door, which was shut behind him. Silence fell. At 1900 hours, a thud was heard, followed by the wail of one of the women within the room. A minute later, the door opened once again. "Hübner," came the next call. Another man stepped forward and solemnly walked through the door. 1903. Another thud. "Kuchhoff." 1906. Thud. "Veselek Frieda." The wailing woman was guided to the door. Eyes watched wide as the hunched and defeated body was walked into the darkness beyond. 1909. Thud. Goetze. So this was it. This was her time. She left behind a room full of women awaiting the same fate. Through the door she entered the room where the others had walked in, but not out. It was long and open, besides the guards and some who had been recruited to do the unenviable tasks. It was empty bar for one piece of equipment that summarized the Nazi regime against which she had struggled. A wooden bench, a hole at one end that led into a metal basket, above which the angled blade of the guillotine hung. The bench looked toward 2 long, thin, arched windows that allowed for a little light into the room to pass, but only really enough to clearly illuminate the wooden beam before it, from which hung 6 hooks. Pushed forward, she was brought to the bench. She had resisted the regime, a regime that was built on war, hunger, lies, and the Gestapo. She had spread ideas, helped to save lives, supported those considered degenerate by the government. She may not have fired a bullet, but resistance is not only in the armed struggle. The spreading of words, the enlightenment of the people, has the potential to be far more dangerous. So dangerous that those at the top fear them so greatly, they would murder gladly. She went forward to where the guards pointed quietly. Her resistance was at an end. 1912, thud. There were 16 people executed that evening in 45 minutes at Plötzensee prison. Many came from the same group, but how many knew of the others cannot be said. The Gestapo were exceptionally powerful, and the groups that may have circled around a few central figures were fragmented and knew not of others who were involved in the same cause. How large for certain was the Rotterkapelle of Schulz, Beuys and Harnack? It cannot be said, and therefore it also cannot be said for sure how large the resistance against Hitler was. So secretive were the groups, it often wasn't until later, even long after the war, that stories were revealed of those involved, such as the Protestant minister there at the end of Ursula's life, Harold Pulschau, who also was a resistance fighter against the National Socialist regime of Hitler. A few days after Ursula's murder by the regime, her parents received the letter. It read, "My dear mother, my dear father. Unfortunately, I was not able, due to a technical difficulty, to give you the news of me earlier. I thank you most sincerely for your dear letters. The first one I received after talking to Papa was so heartfelt that I was deeply moved. Mother, I know. You didn't want to annoy me with your lines, and I hadn't wanted to say that in the letter either. I was only afraid that you wouldn't have understood that after what I experienced last year, all my thinking was directed towards the sciences, and cleaning and cooking had to be done as a matter of course as a sideline. This to explain the misunderstanding that would otherwise possibly oppress you. I am still very happy about the permission to speak, because this way Daddy could convince himself personally that I am not a nervous wreck, and this should be a comfort and an incentive for you to bear the fate. Today I am about to embark on my last journey, which we all have to take some time. I could imagine that the thought of the long period of imprisonment after the sentence passed on me is particularly painful for you, and that is why I will tell you about it later. I wrote once before, deepening suffering, but to what extent, I would not have thought possible. I become so receptive to everything great and beautiful on earth that I first became aware of my humanity. I had found interest in so many things. I took pleasure in the pursuit of knowledge that had suddenly become so productive. I felt deepened and transformed and truly able to start life anew, and for this reason I regret now resonates in my devotion to destiny. Only recently I had realized Lessing's words. I would reach for the pursuit of knowledge and not for knowledge itself. I was no longer such a fool and would have had more confidence in myself in the future and would have mastered life already. I would have made positive use of the self-knowledge I had gained. It was strange how just after the judgment all vitality had broken through in me, and how I also lived the life remaining to me consciously, really as a striving person. It would be a great comfort to me if I could hope that you, my dear parents, could also put yourself above things and fill the gap that is now being torn into your life with something new and beautiful. Your strenuous activity may kill off the painful thoughts, but it cannot eradicate them. But you should also find times of contemplative calm and peace of mind in your old age. I greet you from my heart, my dear parents, asking you to approach your life in this way. I think of you, Ilse and Eberhard, in deep love. Your Ursula. Thank you for listening to the Achtung History Podcast, written and presented by myself, Simon J. James, and produced by theberlintourguide.com. This week's episode, Resistance, Ursula Goetze. To find out more, visit the website at theberlintourguide.com/Achtung History. Follow on Twitter and Instagram @Achtung History, or support the continued production of this podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/Achtung History.